And we're back on possibly the worst Italian road we've driven on so far, in the second worst weather we've driven in so far.
cut to an example of
cut to that
video
you
from
took
the other day.
you took in La Spezia. Yeah.
Coming out the tunnel. And
There's a tower out there, believe it or not, and we're aquaplaning.
oh yeah, there it is.
We're currently not actually technically under control. We're just in an aquaplaning drift on the wheels technically. We made it 175 kilometres and we're probably going to die on a slow route in the outskirts of the spin.
Anyway, let's get back to the questions.
Yep.
So, Starfleet uses a main battery doctrine. That is, a ship puts all of its weapon power into a single phase beam rather than multiple beam pulses, and then the Borg appear, and that approach seems to change with, like, the Defiant, which uses pulse fire. And so I suppose the question would be, what's the benefit of changing up the armament profile, going from almost what we discussed with the Ambassador class or Warrior, the ability to engage multiple targets, to then something like the Defiant, where it's, or indeed even the Enterprise E, it's much more hyper-focused in that forward arc.
Yeah, so it's a bit of an interesting one, because on the one hand you're focusing a lot of your firepower forward, but on the other hand your individual shots are getting smaller and more numerous. You know, obviously the Defiant's the big example, but the Enterprise E in, for example, Nemesis, even First Contact, come to think of it, whereas you might expect a Galaxy class, like say when those two Galaxy class annihilate a Galore in Sacrifice of Angels, they fire and they keep firing one big beam for an extended period of time. Whereas when the Enterprise is shooting at the weak point in the Borg cube, or when they're going after the scimitar, or whatever, as well as firing torpedoes and so forth, they're actually firing multiple phaser beams. Perhaps from the same emitters quite often, but there's a very quick recharge time, so they're hitting them with a beam, then hitting them with another beam and another beam and another beam, rather than just sustaining a single burst of fire.
I think in the context of the Borg, that's very obviously because you're rotating your weapon frequencies, so they can never adapt. And particularly when you consider you're rotating your weapon frequencies and all the other ships shooting at the cube are also rotating their weapon frequencies, and there's always going to be shots that are getting through that Borg shield.
But I think there's also perhaps a degree of almost retro school of fire coming through, because obviously in World War I, World War II, it's all about the big broadside from the big guns. But prior to that, from kind of the late 1880s through to the mid 1900s, maybe the very, very early 1900s, you've got this idea of the hail of fire, where the recharge reload at that point in time of your big guns is so low, and the rate of fire of your smaller, medium caliber guns is actually quite a bit faster thanks to the advent of quick firing technology, that people start to think of in terms of saturating your opponent with lots of smaller, less damaging hits that add up quite quickly collectively, and then finishing off the rather dazed, confused and battered enemy ship with a couple of big hits from your big guns. And I think the Defiant, to a certain degree, and also the secondary battery is also growing because of the threat of torpedo boats. And I think the Defiant especially epitomises this. So you could almost see the Defiant as the sort of the 6-inch quick-firing secondaries are its pulse phases, and the quantum torpedoes are the equivalent of the big guns. Now, obviously, at that point in history, ships also carried torpedo launchers to do pretty much the coup de grace. But the reference between early 1900s torpedoes and Star Trek torpedoes, I think, is a bit too far. So, analogy-wise, they're actually closer to maybe the big, slow-firing 12-inch guns. And that makes a certain degree of sense, because then if Defiant is going off after the torpedo boat equivalent, the Jem'hadar fighters, the Varels, etc., it's using its pulse phasers to destroy them. And when it's going after the big capital ships, what we consistently see is they don't gun down Galores and Jem'hadar battlecruisers and so forth, and even Breen ships, just with sustained pulse phaser fire.
No, yeah,
But they hit them a few times, and then they follow up with the quantum torpedoes, which is kind of a very shortened version of the hail and fire doctrine. So rather than soften up the ship by destroying its fire control systems and the other ship's secondary guns and setting fires and everything, in this case they're softening up the shields.
Yes, yeah.
Enough that and occasionally you hear them like, oh, we crippled their engines, or there's fluctuations in their power grid, and then you hit them with the big gun, which is the quantum torpedo, to finish them off. And I think to a certain degree you also see that reflected with the battles the Enterprise is in. So I think Starfleet has maybe shifted over from we're going to hit them once and hit them hard and overwhelm them.
Yes. Because if you don't kill, that's the thing for the Enterprise key, if you don't defeat the enemy with that alpha strike, it's like, oh,
now what?
Oh no.
Yeah. Whereas if you're just hitting the enemy constantly and then following up with a big punch, I think that's a more versatile tactic.
Yes.
Especially in an era when, I mean, this is the other thing, when you think about why would Starfleet have developed that other doctrine, the big single shot doctrine? Well, in the period that they're developing it, the Romulans are nowhere to be seen. Mm-hmm. They've kind of got an alliance with the Klingons, so the only real threats they're ever facing are small-scale powers like the Zinkethi,
Cardassians,
mid-sized powers like the Cardassians, who are generally speaking technologically and numerically inferior.
Yes.
At which point,
big gun.
Yeah, the idea of coming in, obliterating your opponent with a single shot and then leaving, it denies your opponent the ability to do anything in return. It's got a huge intimidation factor.
Yes.
And it's quite efficient.
Yes.
But then, once you come across people who either massively outnumber you, like the Jem'hadar with their infinite attack ships,
yes.
Or potentially the Romulans with big Deredexes.
I mean, the thing with the Romulans is, I think there is an instance where it might actually be they were thinking about the Romulan threat, because Romulan ships are going to cloak and decloak an attack and then recloak. You've got a very small window in which you can actually return fire.
Yeah.
So you want to make sure you hit them hard as well.
Yeah, but that probably would have been in an era when the Romulan ships were quite a bit smaller.
Yes, that's
whereas
true.
once you're in the era of the Deredex, it's like
not going to cut
you can hit them with a massive phaser blast from a galaxy, but honestly, one phaser blast from a galaxy is not going to kill a Deredex.
Yes.
Whereas, saturation attacks, death by 1,000 cuts, suddenly you're operating from a very different tactical paradigm, but one that fits the situation they now find themselves in. The other thing is as well, when you're talking about stealth opponents like a Deredex, or possibly the Klingons with an Egbar or a Vorcha or something, I think something that doesn't really get examined too much is that if you have something like a rapid firing phaser beam like you see on the Sovereigns, or pulse fire especially like you see with Defiant, if your opponent is cloaking and decloaking, doing hit and run, if you have your one big beam, you either have a target lock or you don't. If you have multiple pulses of fire going out, they are essentially unguided as soon as you fire them.
Yes.
And so you often see the Defiant doing these kind of strafing runs. But that means that if you're in the middle of shooting at your opponent and they cloak,
you can keep firing.
You can keep firing, but also the fire that you've already put out is still en route. Mm-hmm. And if you've laid down a strafing pattern, then the bits that are connecting right now as they cloak might connect on their shields, but as we know, the shields have to go down unless your shin's on when your cloak is engaged, at which point those later bits of fire from your burst might then hit once
Something.
the ship is cloaked,
Yes.
which will do considerably more damage because it's now unshielded, which is actually quite a bit of a benefit. And you also see this with, to a certain extent, in Nemesis, when they're trying to find the scimitar.
Yeah.
They're doing, firing in all directions with the phaser beams, which is a fairly good idea. Saturate the area. If you hit something, great, and then you know where they are. But we do see they deplete their phaser banks quite quickly in that battle, which does make me wonder. Given that the point of those shots was not to necessarily hurt the scimitar in and of themselves, but find it.
Should it have been lower power? Yeah.
Yeah, but then of course that's the whole thing of if you've got those big phaser arrays, how much power can you drop?
I was about to say, what's the minimum
Yeah.
to actually fire them?
If you were to say, I don't know, refit the Sovereign class because somebody has torn a big chunk out of the forward part of the saucer, it might be useful to revisit the old phaser ball turret idea from the Constitution, not as a replacement, but if you had a few sort of ball turret emplacements with pulse phasers, then those should require a lot less energy per shot.
Yes.
And you could absolutely fill the heavens with thousands of pulse phaser shots very, very quickly, with a much better manual search for a clone ship.
Yes. And that actually sort of goes into STO, where you've got a lot of those 25th century ships, and they will have these sort of pulse mounts on the front of the saucer now.
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of sense. Why
Unless you're me and you just put omnidirectional beams on the back and regular beams on the front and just go around being the Disco Inferno.
So the next question is, what naval period do you see post-nemesis 25th century Starfleet most closely mirroring? I suppose there's actually two questions in there, because I think there's post-nemesis, which is actually technically the lower decks period, and then there's the 25th century, which is quite a technological leap.
It's STO kind of.
Yeah. Yes, effectively.
I mean, it's a little bit difficult to say because some of it, especially because in not so much in STO, but to a certain extent, and definitely in lower decks, you certainly get the kind of slightly ineffective, woolly, occasionally actually evil Starfleet Admiral trope coming into full play. And then you've got ships like the Cerritos, which, it's essentially a gunboat.
Yes.
It's a gunboat or a frigate.
Yes.
So, at least style-wise, the immediate post-nemesis Starfleet seems to me at least to remind me very much of perhaps like the mid-19th century Royal Navy.
Yeah, it's a hodgepodge.
Yeah, it's a hodgepodge of various things. They're incorporating new technology. They've got some really old stuff. They're trying to find themselves to a certain degree of what are we now coming off of the Dominion?
Yes,
but we don't want to be
fighting force.
Yeah, we don't want to be the more polite Klingons, but
yes,
we can't go back to being the TNG era.
Yeah.
And that kind of is very reflected in the kind of, say, mid-19th century Royal Navy, where they're coming off being a global war-fighting force in the Napoleonic Wars. They're still trying to maintain their primacy, but they're also doing all these various voyages of exploration. And you have this weird, wonderful mix of Age of Sail ships of the line, and steam-powered ships, and iron-hulled ships, and armoured ships.
Are you getting... Because a lot of ships in that period, they were sort of converted from just being pure sailing to sailing, but you've also got a steam engine.
Yeah.
Was some plated as well?
Yes, with the introduction of Warrior, they took a bunch of wooden ships, cut them down a little bit, slapped a bunch of iron plating on them, and said, "Hey, we've got a cheap and cheerful ironclad." Not necessarily going to last tremendously long, but it was a way of bulking up the numbers while the main ironclad production got up and running.
Yes, which to me is sort of reminded of the like Urbana class that you see in lower decks, which is they've shrunk down some Sovereign nacelles and they bolted it to an Excelsior class.
Yeah.
And look, we have a new ship class. But that is very much sort of screaming of we're doing everything we can to keep these things going. I think isn't there it is in a holodeck, but there's one where Mariner is like in a modernised Miranda.
Yes.
So it's all these things of we're trying to sort of modernise, but also keeping these older ships around.
Yeah, and I think by the time you get to like the STO Picard era, so 25th century, that actually reminds me a lot more of the beginning of the 20th century, like the 1900s, the 1910s. So you've got this sort of step change with things like the Odyssey and the Typhoon, and these, Starfleet's embracing the big dreadnought style.
Yes.
But also you've got in STO somewhat represented by their own designs, somewhat represented by the refits you can get, like the Ross refit of the Galaxy and so forth. And in Picard, you've got things like the Excelsior 2 and the Stargazer B or whatever it is. This idea of like the old stuff but new.
Yes.
So in the early 20th century, you've got the protected cruisers being replaced by the light armoured cruiser that will eventually become the light cruiser dash cruiser. The armoured cruisers being supplemented by the battle cruiser. The dreadnoughts replacing the battleship. The torpedo boats being replaced by the destroyer. The coastal submarines being replaced by a submarine that can actually go more than like 50 miles without needing fresh sandwiches. It's a whole evolutionary period that I think the Picard and STO era certainly captures.
Yes.
And with the more recent, and I say more recent, maybe the last 5 or 6 expansions of STO, as they've kind of tried to advance that from tier 5 to tier 6 to tier 6 plus, and various new designs that have been factored in. That kind of reminds me very much of the 1910s going on early 1920s, as people are starting to iterate and develop.
Yes, that's sort of
more down the lines of this new paradigm.
Post-war thing.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think particularly personal favourite, the Regent class. I think that's a very good example of that. It knows what it is. It's not unsure of itself.
Yes.
It's like, yes, I am a big scary warship. I'm also a nice explorer ship as well.
Yes.
So, next question is there any historical precedent for captains leading landing parties?
Plenty. Plenty. It's basically the age of sail.
Yes.
So back in the 19th century, personal valor was much. I mean, it's not that personal valor has gone away, but what defines personal valor was very different back then. I mean, you had a lot more boarding actions for various reasons, mostly to do with what you were actually getting when you launched that boarding action. But leading captains very often would lead boarding actions. Nelson managed to lose both, for various bits of himself, trying to lead shore actions for the most part.
Just imagining, would Nelson, would he be a cyborg, or if it's, because this is sounding basically like original series, is he just going to end up in the Pike chair?
Well, I suppose it depends which era of Star Trek you're looking at, because like TNG DS9, even to a certain extent Voyager, but perhaps not so much because they had limited resources. They're operating almost on Harry Potter levels of magic, except we call it science. So it'll be like, oh yes, Captain Nelson, you seem to have lost an arm. Well, you're going to stay in sick bay and we'll regrow you a new one overnight.
Yes.
Whereas if it was perhaps Discovery era, with the late lamented was it Atem? Robot lady.
Oh, Ariam,
that's it. I knew it was something like that. And even at that point, Detmer with her eyebrow thing.
7 of 9.
there's a lot more not cyborgization, but cyberization,
So yeah,
replacement stuff. So yeah, it's not quite as clear in TOS, because I think in TOS they probably would have loved the opportunity to have a bunch of cybernetics, but they couldn't afford it.
Yes.
So yeah, I think 23rd century Starfleet Nelson would gradually become kind of a slightly more friendly version of a Borg drone. Whereas, 24th, 25th century Starfleet, they'd be like, oh yes, you've lost another limb. We'll put that one up in the stasis field with the other 16.
Yes.
And we'll stick a new one on later tonight.
That's exactly what happens to Nog.
Yes, exactly. I mean, if 24th century Captain Nelson fought the Klingons, there'd be a certain diminishment of value of his body parts in the Klingon Empire, because they'd be like,
Keeps growing them back.
Yeah, they'd be like, yes, well, I fought that human Nelson, and I took his leg off in valiant combat, and they're like, yeah, you and every other third captain in the Klingon Defense Force. Look, we've all got bits of him.
We still can't kill him.
Yeah.
So next question, here's an odd one. The start of the Dominion War, which kicks off with the wormhole being mined, Deep Space Nine captured, and the Federation Klingon alliance launching an attack on the Monac shipyard. Monac shipyards? No, it's the Taurus shipyards.
One of them.
Taurus shipyards. In universe, do you reckon the person that dreamed up this attack was inspired by the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Probably not the attack on Pearl Harbor, because the whole point of Pearl Harbor was the surprise attack that kicks off the war. Although it's so massively telegraphed, Ducat might as well have had like a little receiving station on his head. The attack on DS9 is probably closer to the Pearl Harbor, in that, Pearl Harbor occurs without a declaration of war. It in of itself is the declaration of war.
Yes.
While they're not quite as sneaky, the Dominion does just sort of show up and basically go, here's a bunch of our demands, accede or we'll shoot you, and then proceeds to shoot them. So it's not too many stages removed from Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
The big Federation counterattack that immediately follows that, I don't think there's a particularly clear analogy in the Second World War, because
I was going to say that, like, the raid on Taurus, those shipyards, would have been more equivalent to the attacks on the Ruhr dams. Because also, it's not that you're looking at immediately, with Pearl Harbor, you're looking at immediately knocking out a large portion of the enemy's combat power.
Yeah.
Whereas with the attack on the Ruhr dams, you're looking at knocking out that industry. So, and that's a much more long-term objective. And that's, when you're attacking a shipyard, that's really what you're doing.
Yeah, I can see that. My only hesitation with that is that the Ruhr Dam attacks, Operation Chastise, is it's a small elite force going after a specific objective, whereas at the end of the attack on DS9, it's like the Federation's shown up in numbers heretofore unseen.
Yes, well that's not necessarily the fleet that attacked the shipyards.
No, but they were certainly off doing something.
Yes, when I depicted the Battle of Taurus, it was a smallish task force, but again, elite, so it's Sovereign and Akira's.
Okay, yeah. But I mean, just going by what we see on screen, I would say possibly one analogy would be maybe the battles of Narvik. So you've got the Germans in this case taking the role of the Dominion. They go in, they've taken Narvik off of a third party, the Norwegians. So depending on how you want to look at that could, as a surprise attack, that could either be the taking of Deep Space Nine, or it could even be the Dominion allying with Ducat.
Yes, yeah.
At which point the second battle of Narvik, where these destroyers go in, they shoot up some of the German destroyers, but ultimately end up having to leave. That could be actually seen as it's not perfectly analogous to the taking of Deep Space Nine, because at that point the Germans already had Narvik. where they get some good blows in but have to leave. That's kind of like the battle with Deep Space Nine, because
Yes.
they take a good chunk out of that Dominion fleet, but they do end up having to withdraw.
Yes, yeah.
And then the follow-on, when Warspite and company show up and just obliterate the German destroyer forces there, that's like, you know, whatever the heck that massive Federation fleet at the end of that season was off
Yes.
to do.
Yes. Yes, we certainly hope to do, yes. Yeah, I think that's a good parallel.
And to be honest, like the way that's generally established, as in kind of the Federation realised it couldn't necessarily hold Deep Space Nine, so they used the opportunity for a bait and switch to go and smash up something else. That's actually a very pragmatic and sensible tactic. It's like one of the first times the Starfleet Corps of Admirals actually grew a brainstem.
Yes. Yes, we are not just going to say everything will be fine.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe they even went to like Zakdawn and plucked one of their tacticians off. It was like, hey, we actually need to fight a war, please.
Oh, you want us to stop playing this our game? So, next question, not so much a real world Navy question, but why would you design a starship to land on land, but not water? It seems like you could also be a submarine if you could also go into atmosphere, and this would be a better way to land on in alien inhabited worlds, since you wouldn't have ground pressure issues.
Well, of course, we see in the sort of the new Trek movies, we see the Enterprise does exactly that.
Yeah.
It's actually still one of the most hilarious and awesome, simultaneously hilarious and awesome scenes from that film series. But I think the major problem you're going to have is a starship in space has to withstand usually an atmosphere or so of internal pressure trying to pop it.
Yes.
So you design your ship to withstand internal pressure, because external pressure isn't really a thing unless you do something dumb like a binary pulsar or something.
Yes.
Yeah, Janeway. But if you land on a planet, you're now, at least if you're landing on a regular planet like an M-class or something, you're going to be subjected to anywhere between half and a few atmospheres of pressure externally. But broadly speaking,
even out.
The design of something to withstand internal versus external pressure, there are going to be some differences, but broadly speaking, the stresses should be similar enough that if you design a good enough safety factor, you should be fine.
Yes.
The two problems with landing on water is, one, if you're landing on water, you have to calculate buoyancy and centre of gravity for your ship as if it was an actual ship.
Yes.
Whereas if you land on land, unless you are hilariously top heavy, as long as you've got some Voyager style landing gear, you'll just sit there.
Be okay. Yeah.
Although quite how Voyager avoids tipping forward.
I was about to say Voyager, Defiant, sure. Yeah. Voyager, it's.
They've either got some really, really, really heavy counterweight in engineering,
or they've had everyone run to the back of the ship,
or they're just permanently using anti-grav generators at the front.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you land a starship in the sea, you're either going to probably just flip over, which is going to be embarrassing, and be bounced and rolled around by the waves. Or you're going to have to sink the ship sufficiently into the water that, at least if we're assuming Federation designs, that sort of your engineering section becomes more like a giant keel.
Yes.
To stabilise the saucer, which potentially could remain on the surface. The problem with that is that at the scale of starships, even if your saucer is on the surface, if you're talking about anything that's not one of the slimline ones like a Sovereign or a Intrepid, most Starfleet designs, the engineering section is then going to be several hundred feet down
and subject to those
to huge amounts of external pressure, which it is not designed to deal with.
Yes.
Now, of course, you can argue structural integrity fields and so on, but part of at least the impression you're given when Voyager lands, part of the point of being able to land is to give the ship a little bit of a break. And if you're having to ramp your structural integrity fields up to 10 times the regular power output to stop your engineering section crumpling like a tin can, that's not
going to work.
That's not really helping.
No. I think but also the best way to do it is because then also you're subjecting everything to gravity as well. You're at least 1G, potentially more. Are like, for example, your nacelle pylons, are they rated for that? Voyager, it gets away with it because those are actually very chunky pylons
and quite short
and quite small nacelles. With something like particularly that JJ prize, it is like, well, I'm just wondering if surely the moment it just comes into the atmosphere, into the gravitational pull, the weight of those nacelles would just rip themselves off of.
Yeah, I mean the JJ prize has some advantages over some Star Trek, at least Federation ship designs, in that the pylons are quite. They're not vertical, but they're quite tall.
Steep, yeah.
They're quite steep, so that would help.
Yes. Rather than being sort of out.
And I suppose that would possibly be the one plus of a water landing, where most of your ship is submerged, and that your water would be supporting the ship to a certain degree. But it's not brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. So I think the context would be you might use a water landing if you're not actually meant to be on a planet, period.
Yes.
If you're designed to land on a planet, just land on the surface.
Yeah, I mean the other thing you've got to remember is if you hit water at any appreciable speed, it's not all that dissimilar from hitting concrete. So crash landing into the sea from orbit, that's not the saving grace move you might think. Whereas, I mean, okay, smashing straight into a mountainside, also not fantastic, but the chances of surviving either are not great. Whereas, emergency landing,
yes,
especially with a saucer, which should be a relatively stable flotation device, that's not a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Especially because the one big advantage you would have in a water landing would at least be the fact that the sea, relative speaking to the size of a Starship saucer, assuming you don't land in the middle of a storm, is going to be relatively flat, rather than the let's demolish half the mountain range of the Enterprise D's land.
Yes, I was about to say, if that saucer just landed in the water, that's going to break its fall, and it probably would be buoyant because you've got that nice.
Yeah, as long as your structural integrity fields keep the leaks out.
Yes. Okay. How does the episode Valiant contrast with the Rheinübung operation and even Defiant's power coupling unit? Valiant's Defiant power coupling being hit by Dominion forces parallel the situation to what Bismarck experienced with the rudder. I don't know if they're talking about the Valiant being hit.
Well, the Valiant was limited to warp 3 when they.
Oh yes.
When they beamed aboard and Knock had to fix it. I mean,
I forgot about that.
That's actually a fairly good analogy, except for the fact that it's both simultaneously a good and terrible analogy. It's a good analogy in that yes, it's crippled the Valiant's ability to essentially manoeuvre and go places at speed, which is precisely what the problem with Bismarck was. However, it kind of shows you the spectacular stupidity of the Red Squad cadets, in that at least with Bismarck, when they were like, we've got a massive hole in our bow and one of our rudders doesn't work properly and we're going in circles, they decided actually maybe we should go home. In fact, they were already going home when the rudder was hit.
Yes.
Whereas Red Squad are like, you know what, we're limited to a speed that's about the same as a cheap and cheerful 22nd century privately owned freighter. Even the NX-01 is faster than us. I know, let's go hunting the biggest Dominion warship known to the Federation.
Yeah.
That's kind of analogous to, after Bismarck's taken its rudder hit, they just turn around and go, actually, you know what, screw it, we're still going after convoys.
Yes. I mean, possibly
come back, convoy!
Possibly the thinking, if I was to really justify it, the thinking is, well, we're so slow that no one's going to think we're a warship.
Yeah, this is true. It's like relying on sheer incredulity of the enemy. But the thing is that that might work against the Klingons or the Romulans, because at least the Klingons would have a good laugh at you first, then shoot you.
Yes.
The Dominion would be more like, well, it's got a Federation warp signature, destroy it anyway.
Yes, unless they manage to mask their warp signature.
Yeah.
But these are cadets, so I don't know if they can really do that.
But I mean, ignoring that, I mean, once they get back up to speed with Nog's help, the whole one ship out there alone trying to hunt down something. I mean, again, it's a simultaneously perfect and terrible analogy to Operation Rheinübung, because on the one hand, yes, it's one ship out there alone trying to do something. On the other hand, Bismarck's general orders were cripple the enemy supply lines by attacking the convoys, and if you have to fight enemy warships, then do so. Whereas Valiant, and obviously initially is on a training cruise, but then they take it into their heads of let's go on a one-man hunting expedition against something that significantly outguns us.
Yes.
It'd be the equivalent of, if Tovey had taken King George V and Victorious, as well as Prince of Wales and Hood, and all four of them had shown up at the Battle of Denmark Strait, if Lutyens had gone, you know what, actually I'm going to just charge headlong at them and go for it, that's kind of the Red Squad level of lunacy. I do wonder if Red Squad is supposed to be this elite force, and the second time we see them is obviously when Leighton tries to pull off the coup.
Yes, yeah.
And to be fair, at that stage, they actually do their jobs relatively well. It's just a bit unfortunate for them that Cisco happens to be able to get 2 steps ahead of them.
Yes.
But the level of sheer stupidity you see, not necessarily out of the entirety of Red Squad, because some of the lower ranking ones are like, actually, this is a dumb idea, we should go home.
Yes.
But certainly the upper echelons, and particularly the cadet in charge, it kind of makes you wonder, is this an elite squad because it's an elite group of cadets, or is this the next generation of Starfleet admirals as selected by the previous generation of Starfleet admirals? It's like, we've selected the most brain-dead, brash lunatics, and we're going to put them on the fast track of command so that they can be put in flag positions where they can't do much damage, while we let the competent people actually out on long-term careers as starship captains.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that, unfortunately makes a lot of sense. Oh dear. So, the next question. If the Federation were like NATO in space and the Klingons are like the Soviet Union in space, particularly in TOS, are there various Star Trek factions and their navies anything like their real-life inspirations? Is there a clear example of a Star Trek navy being inspired by historical naval force? Well, I think that we've kind of covered that. Yeah, well, I mean, TOS, the Starfleet is, for all intents and purposes, the US Navy in space, with some of the more nationalistic serial numbers filed off sometimes. Yes. I mean, you still get, there's still a lot of references to the US Constitution, and I mean, it's the Constitution class. It's still very America centric, albeit again, it's American TV shows made in the 1960s. Of course it is. Yeah. But as we've said previously, the style is much more Age of Sail Royal Navy almost. Yeah, to a degree. I mean, I think especially once you take into account Enterprise and some of the, not necessarily expanded universe law, but some of the the stuff that we learn about the period outside of the TOS series in and of itself. Yes. I think that makes TOS Federation look considerably more NATO-like. Yes. Because then once you factor in things like what you learn in TNG about there actually being still Vulcan ships, specifically, it's the idea that the Vulcan High Command and the Tallarite Fleet and Andorian Imperial Headquarters, they all still have their own fleets, as well as the generic Starfleet in which everybody is. Yes. It's kind of like a slightly more advanced version of the main fleet behind NATO being the US Navy, and with some exchange officers, except in Starfleet's case, they're full officers. Yes. And then everyone else still has their own
sort of satellite fleets which can do their own thing within.
Yes. So I was about to say, so do you think it's like how they sort of suggest it is in the Axonar film, where they say everyone's using the same ships, there's just some with Tellarite and Andorian crews, or are you thinking that they're still building their own ships in their distinct styles?
I have a feeling there's still an element. I think there's probably like a two-part thing of there's probably a certain distinct styling going on.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like we see in TNG, you see the ships that the Romulans co-opt.
Yes,
and they're still the
T'Pau.
T'Pau. They're clearly evolutions of the ring nacelle
Yes.
aesthetic that we retroactively see in Enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's certainly still a certain amount of local design.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think equally there's certain design styles sort of find their way into the various ships. So for example, the Tellarite ships, which in Enterprise have these sort of embedded nacelles in the front of the ship. Well, you look at something like Steamrunner.
Yeah.
That looks very Tellarite all of a sudden.
Yeah, so I think fleet-wise, you're probably looking at what I'm sure some people these days are hoping NATO will be like in 30 or 40 years' time. You're seeing some trends of that, like the Belgian and Dutch Navy sharing designs. You've got the FREM series, which like Italy and France and a few others have shared bits of. And the Type 45 is sort of related to them. But I think you're a couple of generations away from that kind of everyone's using the same ships
Exact same
in
integration.
Starfleet but with different crews.
Yes.
Perhaps in modern terms, again, although the political unity of NATO, the political unity of the Federation are very different things, but perhaps a closer analogy these days would maybe be to look at the air forces,
Yes.
where a lot of nations used to operate the F4, then they operate the F-16 or the F-18, F-A-18, and now a bunch of them are operating F-35s. At which point, kind of like, as you say with Axonar, like there's a bunch of Starfleet ships with different crews. Well, there's a bunch of Lockheed Martin aircraft with different pilots.
Yes. Yeah.
But there's still some elements where not everyone operates Black Hawks, for example.
Yes.
There's a lot of air forces operate helicopters from their own local manufacturers and such.
Well, it is even the point of like, well, not everyone in NATO can have or build a US-style supercarrier.
Yes.
And that's the point where I suppose you go from TOS, where it's actually reasonable to expect all these member states to build their own ships, and they'll be relatively on par. But then you get up to the Galaxy class or Ambassador class, and then that perhaps signals that's when they're starting to really homogenize and start building these ships together.
Yeah, I think if you're going to see a sort of a Starfleet-esque thing in the modern era, naval-wise, see the main problem is Starfleet is also a unified command structure, not just the unified shipping design. I think because AUKUS would potentially be a vector for that, with the US, Australian and Royal Navies all sharing a common attack sub-design, if that comes off, but they are still very definitely going to be under their own chains of command.
Yeah.
Whereas I think if the EU decides to go down the Greater Federated States of Europe route, in the short term, that's probably the most likely where you're going to see a sort of Starfleet thing. If you can persuade the European navies to accede to at least a nominal European command structure,
Yes.
then in theory you might also see some agreement around at least some common hull types.
Yes.
But that's still fairly unlikely in the next couple of decades.
Yes. That's the thing. It's like, yes, we'd like to be the Federation, but ultimately, the whole point of Star Trek is that is in the future. We've got
Yes.
to work to get there. So, final question. Was it a mistake for the Dominion to cancel the Hutets and build Jem'hadar Battleships as capital ships for the fleet instead? Also, if these battleships weren't worth the opportunity cost, where would you invest the resources spent on those vessels?
I think it would depend very much on how, because obviously in theory the Jem'hadar battleship is a more technologically advanced piece of kit.
Yes.
The Hutet mostly gets its ridiculous levels of firepower durability just by being absolutely colossal.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it probably comes down to how fast and how many of each could you build for a given level of resource input. Because in theory, you could argue that since the Hutet is just lots of fairly basic Cardassian technology massed in one place,
you can build those pretty quickly.
yeah, and potentially even if the build time is long, you could potentially have them in fairly large numbers.
Yes.
Not quite every Cardassian shipyard can build a Hutet, but perhaps most of the big Cardassian shipyards could build a Hutet, and let's say the smaller and medium-sized ones could at least build components of a Hutet.
Whereas with a Dominion battleship, like to actually build those en masse, you'd need the eaves type station, that bit of concept art and that thing is Italian driving. That thing is like 19-20 kilometers across.
Yes,
it's huge, and I don't think the Dominion ever built anything like that.
I mean, they obviously, as we saw at the end of the Dominion War, they did have some Dominion battleships.
They had like 5
in the bit that we saw.
Yes,
they're obviously.
But that is all in. So that I think I estimated there's about 11 or so at the end.
Yeah,
there's not many.
Not many, but the thing is, if it's going to take you, let's say, 2 years arbitrarily to build a Dominion battleship, and it's going to take you 2 years to build a Hutet, because it's bigger but it's slightly easier to build, so maybe that balances out, then it might be worth going with the Dominion battleships, because they, being more advanced, will be able to conduct more missions and be a bit more effective. Whereas, and I think it also depends on when was the Hutet's design finalised.
Yeah.
Because if it's kind of the Cardassians have been working on this super weapon of theirs, and it's only just come to fruition, and it's going to take them 6 months to finish the design for the Dominion battleships, and then they can work on them, then great, fantastic, it's probably worth doing the Dominion battleships. Whereas if it's kind of, well, we've already built a Hutet, and the war happens to have just come around, and we can lay down a bunch more right now.
Yes.
But it's going to take 6 months of design, 6 months of building, 2 years of testing, and so on and so forth, to get the battleship, Jem'hadar battleship, to a point where you're happy to say yes, mass production.
And then it's got to build the infrastructure to do that mass production.
Then at that point, it makes more sense to. It makes much more sense at that point to just go, yeah, you know what, we'll stick with building the Hutets.
We'll run with the Hutets.
And you kind of see this argument to a certain degree play out in World War One and World War Two, where initially most nations' first instinct is actually to stick with what they know.
Yeah.
They're like, okay, we're gonna. War has come, we need things as fast as possible, we're going to build the designs that we have.
Yes.
We might be working on new stuff in the background, but we're not going to not build our existing stuff. But the only exception of that being somewhere like the US, which one, isn't involved in the war for the first couple of years, and two, even if it is, when it is, it's got the advantage of distance, so it's not being attacked
imminently.
Yeah, so they can iterate from the North Carolinas to the South Dakotas to the Iowas and potentially even to the Montanas got, or even just focusing on
Yes.
smaller stuff.
Which is, I suppose, why you look at the Federation, which is the one who's in the war
Yeah.
directly, and they're building the galaxy. Basically, they're just printing galaxy classes.
Yeah.
They're doing as many sovereigns as they can manage, but
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think at that point I say it comes down to what's the build time and numbers that you can build difference between the Jem'hadar Battleship and Hutet, and when are those designs ready for mass production?
yes.
So it could be a mistake or it could be a good idea depending on those factors.
Yeah. Well, I think the Hutet was actually, I think I said in Hunting the Hutets, it was completed relatively early. It just spent the first half of its life hiding in Cardassia Prime, because that was when the Klingon invasion happened, and it's like, well, there's no point sending it out now to get massacred by the Klingons.
Yeah.
And then the Dominion War. So I was like, okay, we've overrun all these Federation outposts and star bases. We need you to basically go around and just batter things down.
Yeah. At which point, if the Hutet is available that early on, then at that point I would say it would have been a mistake to cancel them from a purely strategic point of view. Of course, there's probably also politics involved, like the fact that the Dominion probably don't want their notional allies and their view subservient slave species that hasn't quite realised it yet
Yes.
to be the ones with the biggest and most powerful capital ships out there.
Yes, and that's the thing. Yeah, they do make sure that it's almost like they put their foot in the door and say, well, no, the Hutet got destroyed, we're going to build these instead.
Yeah.
And then a little bit afterwards, when the Romulans joined the war, and it's like, oh, we just need lots of big battleships. Okay, you can resume building the ones that were already laid down.
Yeah,
But
because at that point they've got the Jem'hadar Battleships.
And they've got them in greater numbers than the Cardassians have Hutets. So
Yes.
if needs be, they can always bosh them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's one of the more interesting questions. I kind of said, the Jem'hadar battleship, it's very good if it's on the attack. Defensively, it's very hard to find something for it to do.
Yes.
And when the Dominion employs it, it is on the defense. But that's mostly, I think, tied to the flaws in Dominion Doctrine, where you have the Jem'hadar attack ship, you have the battlecruiser, they synergize pretty well, but then you go up to the size of the battleship, and then suddenly it's a bit of an oddity.
Yeah. But the other thing, of course, is admittedly we only see Dominion battle cruisers and attack ships in the Gamma Quadrant, but at the same time we're kind of given the impression that the wormhole is a little bit beyond Dominion territory, right at the frontiers, much the same way that Bajor is for the Federation.
Yes.
So there's always that kind of question of, was the battleship an invention of the Alpha Quadrant Dominion to address some kind of need that they perceived in their war with the Alpha Quadrant powers, or was the battleship a design that the Dominion already had and was perhaps restricted to its core fleets,
Yes.
and the battle cruisers that we saw were maybe like the Excelsior of the Dominion?
Yes, the workhorse.
And then, partway through the war, they were like, well, we've got these blueprints of stuff we've got back at home. We're clearly not going to get any reinforcements from home anytime soon, so let's build them here.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element to it, and certainly if you go off of then the STO lore of the fleet being transported to the future,
Yeah.
and then you see these Jem'hadar battleships, so they did have them. So, yes. So it's an interesting question. But yeah, definitely the Cardassians get hard done by.
Yeah, that seems to be their lot in life, really.
Much like the Italian Navy. So it gets all the mockery, but actually is probably the only reason the Axis got anywhere.
Yeah.
So I think with that is all the questions.
Yep.
So thank you, Drac, for coming and answering these questions and giving me a lovely holiday in Italy.
And we're finishing up our questions just as it stops raining.
Brilliant.
So Yeah, if you're listening to this, comment below on how good we did with eliminating the sounds of half of the Mediterranean being dumped on our heads, whilst various Italian drivers remain convinced that driving at 60 kilometres an hour above the speed limit is a brilliant idea when you can't see 60 yards ahead of you. But yeah, also that stretch of road was utterly awful.
That was, yeah.
It was like potholes and standing water and everything. Now we're nice,
Lovely,
smooth
straight
roads
level.
as the sun comes out. It's like,
Yeah.
where was this an hour ago?
Anyway,
Oh, well.
thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you all next time.
Yeah, if you're watching this, we didn't get killed by the mob or the Italian drivers.
Bye. So, little bit of an addendum here. We thought we were out of it.
We are not.
We're really not.